I'd like to start with a bit of an introduction. My name is McKay Smith, and I'm an attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice, National Security Division, Office of Intelligence. I'm also an adjunct professor at the George Washington University Law School and the George Mason University School of Law, where I teach courses on government oversight and internal investigations. Because of my position, I need to emphasize from the outset that the views expressed in this video are purely mine, and not that of the Department of Justice or the U.S. government. The story I'm about to tell you is a very special one to me. I sincerely hope that you enjoy it. This video is really a picture narrative of a journey that I went on not too long ago. It's a behind-the-scenes tour designed to inspire others to take part in similar research projects. My goal here is to reach as many people as possible. That's why I've been lecturing on this topic at law schools and academic venues over the past few years. But this year, 2014, is a little bit different. It marks 70 years since the events I'm about to describe, 70 years since D-Day and the beginning of major American combat operations in Europe. I want to start off with a brief excerpt of an article that I wrote. It's really a companion piece to this video, and it goes into much more detail regarding the event that my grandfather witnessed. The Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998 required the U.S. government to expedite the release of classified intelligence related to German war crimes committed during World War II. Although members of Congress were successful in initiating an unprecedented release of information, their efforts are notable for another reason as well. America's lawmakers failed to allocate funds for the continued research and preservation of this material. Rather, they left the substantial responsibility to inquisitive historians and members of the general public. This has led multiple scholars to conclude that there are remarkable fragments of the story which have lain undiscovered in improbable places for more than 50 years. Notably, this is a story about one of those fragments. This is the first picture of my grandfather that I ever saw, and I first saw it in the summer of 2011. I think you can see a bit of a resemblance. My grandfather passed away in 1970 at the age of 46. It was his 5th heart attack. My father and I had been looking for him for decades, but there were a number of things that hindered our search. My father never knew his birth father. He knew few particulars of the man's life. Moreover, my grandfather lied about his age to join the Army Air Corps in 1942, and he kept that fake birth date on my father's birth certificate. Lastly, my grandfather's grave was mismarked on a website for Arlington National Cemetery. Nonetheless, there were some things that we did know about my grandfather. We knew that he was a big man, 6'5". We knew that he had fractured his back when he was shot down over occupied France. He still tried out for the Rams, though, when he returned home from the war. We also knew that my grandfather fought alongside the French resistance for 4 months in the summer of 1944. And we knew that my grandmother met him in Los Angeles in 1946, where he was selling used cars at the time. They were married soon after and had a baby boy, Patrick. We also knew from my grandmother that Ray had a bit of a problem with the ladies, as she put it. My grandmother discovered this in 1948, and she took everything, including my father, and moved back home to Ohio. She ended up marrying again, and she changed baby Patrick's name to Michael, and that's my father, Mike Smith, formerly Patrick Michael Murphy. So my grandfather was clearly an imperfect man, but a man I desperately wanted to know more about. My father looked for him for over 40 years. In 2003, he asked me to take over the search. I suppose it's ironic, then, that a declassified intelligence report held the key to unlocking this mystery. This is Escape and Evasion Report number 866. Escape and evasion reports were a type of intelligence report used during World War II. This particular report, number 866, contains my grandfather's account of what happened to him after his B-17 was shot down by German anti-aircraft fire on April 28, 1944. Here are some points to emphasize about these reports. They were tactical in nature. They contained battlefield information. More importantly, they were used to record successful escape and evasion techniques from airmen who survived their experience. These reports are also used to gather information on German troop movements and concentrations. Of particular note, these documents were not intended to collect information on war crimes. Nonetheless, from reading this report, it's clear that my grandfather's account contains evidence of war crimes committed by German soldiers in occupied France. My grandfather was a navigator with the 91st Bomb Group 324th Squadron. This is the same unit as the crew of the Memphis Belle, the first crew to finish 25 missions and return home as celebrated heroes. Unlike those airmen, however, my grandfather was not as lucky. He was shot down over Avoirdes, France on his 16th mission and subsequently evaded capture for the next 4 months in Nazi-occupied France. Following his return to England, my grandfather was questioned by the Military Intelligence Service at Headquarters European Theater of Operations. His account was recorded in narrative form. At the conclusion of his interview, he signed a security certificate forbidding him from disclosing any facts related to his wartime experience. The resulting report was marked secret. You can see a close-up of the classification markings here in this picture. Publication of this report largely resulted from the push to declassify World War II-era documents. Although this report was first declassified in 1974, it wasn't until 2010 that it was made available to the public in electronic format. In fact, all of these escape and evasion reports were made available that same year. So in other words, don't take my word for it, you can read the report yourself. All you have to do is get online and access it right on the National Archives website. I have to admit, when I first read it, it truly took my breath away. I had dedicated my career to the study of intelligence, but this report was like nothing I had ever seen. It was simply amazing. To see my grandfather's words, this man I never knew, my own flesh and blood, it was an indescribable feeling. As I was flipping through the pages, I found something even more incredible. My grandfather's rather large thumbprint under his signature. And man, was it big. I just kept staring at it, mesmerized. I even remember pressing my thumb up to it, and that's when I had the most overwhelming feeling. It felt as if I was reaching back in time, across all those years, and shaking hands with him. It was a very powerful moment, and one I'll never forget. Little did I know that this report would change my life forever. I read the story again and again those first few days. All the details were there. It matched up perfectly with what I knew about my grandfather. The back injury he sustained when he bailed out over occupied France, fighting with the French resistance. I kept wondering how he survived and what life must have been like for him. And then after a few weeks, I saw something that I hadn't noticed before, a handwritten annotation written in the margin of the report. Thus far, I'd only been reading the typed language. In retrospect, it seems likely that the Army chain of command may have been guilty of doing the same thing. Ultimately, I would go to the archives and pull the original document. I had to make sure I wasn't misreading it. And that's when I was sure of the serious nature of what I was looking at. This is a close-up photograph of the document that I took at the National Archives that day. The words are very hard to see at first, written in almost illegible handwriting. But like I mentioned, you can access the document and see it for yourself, right on the National Archives website. I'm going to read it to you to make it a bit easier. The note says, "About 3 weeks ago, I saw a town within 4 hours' bicycle ride up the Gerbo farm where some 500 men, women, and children had been murdered by the Germans. I saw one baby who had been crucified." So why is this significant? Obviously, it's horrific. Nothing could prepare an individual for the sight of a crucified child. This event is a gross violation of the laws of war. The scale of the crime also makes it unique. There aren't many crimes like this during the war. In fact, it would be one of the largest mass killings that took place in occupied France. What else is significant about this account? I suppose this is where the mystery deepens. My grandfather died before this report was declassified. He never told any members of his immediate family. In addition, the security certificate he signed after his debriefing in '44 kept him from talking about any of these experiences. So this was the beginning of a long journey for me, and the beginning of the story I'm about to tell you. As I'm putting away some related files at the National Archives, I hear a strange noise. It sounds like metal on metal, deep down in the box where these documents are stored. So I reach down in this dusty folder, and I'll never forget what I found next. Dog tags, from the men who had flown with my grandfather on that mission, some from POWs captured on the ground by the Germans, others slightly blackened and misshapen from the resulting fire from their crash. I remember at that time feeling this extreme sense of injustice. Why were these dog tags sitting in old dusty folders? Why hadn't they been returned to these soldiers' families? At that moment, I realized I had to know more about what happened to these men. I started writing letters to anyone and everyone, and when I say letters, I really mean Freedom of Information Act requests for information related to my grandfather's wartime service. I also wrote an article to try to raise awareness of this issue with academics who might be able to help me with my research. I did all of this in my spare time while I worked and taught during the day. I reached out to a number of different experts who, for these purposes, will remain nameless. Individuals at museums, federal government agencies, military organizations, academic journals, you name it, dozens and dozens of inquiries. As I started getting responses from these experts, I noticed a similar pattern. Almost all of these scholars would first admit that they couldn't provide me with a definitive answer. Then they would attempt to discredit my account or to insult me personally. This was not the reaction I was expecting. I remember I was inadvertently CC'd on an email from a UK scholar where he referred to the report as not real history but rather an anecdote. Another expert even insinuated that the document might have been altered. I took this to mean that he suspected me of tampering with it. Needless to say, I was a bit upset. But that's when I realized something I've experienced again and again during this adventure. Scholars can often be lazy. Not only that, but they can sometimes be downright rude. Interestingly, all these so-called experts came to different conclusions when they did offer an explanation. There was no real consensus. Moreover, they seemed overly critical of the document itself or of my work. Like many experts, I think they were scared of things they didn't quite understand or couldn't explain. They were attacking me rather than admit that they didn't have a definitive answer. So as you can imagine, I was disillusioned at first. I didn't know how to proceed. And then it hit me. In fact, the answer is right here in this picture. I had to find the other men that were on that mission, maybe other members of my grandfather's crew that survived. So here they are, the crew of the Cutty Sark, my grandfather's B-17. Interestingly, my grandfather isn't pictured in this crew photograph. There's another navigator in his place. But all this did is really deepen the mystery for me. I simply had to know more about him and these men. There are two airmen here that I want to briefly point out. Clement Dowler is the man pictured in the back row, second from the right. Herbert Campbell is next to him, third from the right in the back row. So please remember their names. These men will be important going forward. The next question I was faced with was, how am I going to find them? Are they still alive? After all, it had been 70 years since the summer of '44. The answer really lay in these declassified documents. Here is a declassified crew manifest from the 324th Squadron Periodic History. This document can be obtained from the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base. So take a look at this document. Why might it be helpful to someone like me? First of all, it has the crew's full names. These same names were on my grandfather's escape and evasion report. More importantly, it has addresses where these men lived in 1944. Simply put, this type of document would be invaluable to a historical researcher. So I started to cross-reference these names with Google searches. Unfortunately, all I found at first were obituaries. I remember that one man, Bernie Swinburne, had passed away only the week prior. I felt especially pained by this because I knew Bernie was the bombardier on my grandfather's B-17. They would have spent a great deal of time together in the nodes of the aircraft during missions. I started going right down the list, all with the same result, obituaries. I was extremely disheartened. And that's when my luck started to improve, with Clement Dowler, the man I mentioned in the crew picture. Clem was the ball turret gunner from the Cutty Sark. For those who don't know, the ball turret is the bubble underneath the belly of the B-17 where they mounted two 50 caliber machine guns. As I would soon learn, Clem was the last surviving member of the crew, and I wouldn't have to look too far to find him. This is a photograph of Clem taken in 1944. He was 20 years old at the time. It was taken in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and by chance he still lives there today. There was news coverage of him in local papers. He even self-published a book. I was also fortunate to find a video of Clem telling the story of what happened to my grandfather's crew on that fateful day. So my next step was to write another letter, although this letter was far different from those I had written to war crime scholars in the previous months. To my surprise, I received a phone call just 2 days later. It was Clem, and he was asking if I had any interest in visiting him. Well, I was ecstatic. The answer was definitely yes. I arranged a visit the very next weekend. As you can imagine, I'm as excited as I've ever been. Here I was thinking that Clem would be able to tell me everything I ever wanted to know about my grandfather. I figured he had all the answers. I made the 6-hour drive from Washington, D.C., palms, sweating, literally the entire way. And upon my arrival, what's the first thing Clem asked me to do? He wants me to prove to him that I could drive his farmall tractor. This picture still makes me laugh looking at it. I grew up a good Ohio boy, but I have to admit I had a little trouble driving that tractor. So after this initial test, and thank goodness I passed, he sat me down to tell me his story. The mission to Avoord was supposed to be a milk run. Airmen used this term to describe what they considered an easy mission. The Avoord airfield was an old French air base, but in 1944 it was occupied by the Germans. Clem said military intelligence reported that there were no anti-aircraft guns on site. As a result, he and his crew came in low, at 15,000 feet. The usual altitude for missions was 25,000 feet. Their B-17, the Cutty Sark, was in for repairs that day, so they were assigned a brand new shiny B-17G. This was notable because their new aircraft was lacking the olive drab paint that helped to camouflage it from ground forces below. Unfortunately, German forces at Avoord had shipped in flak guns by rail in the days prior to the mission. In short, the crew of the Cutty Sark received bad intelligence. I think these pictures really help to bring the story to life. Here's a photograph of German soldiers at the main gate of the Avoord Air Base. These are amazing images. Most are courtesy of the U.S. Air Force. This photograph was given to me by a French historian and friend who helped me a great deal with my research. Again, my point is, don't ever be afraid to reach out to people through letters, emails, or whatever means are available to you. If at all possible, though, I recommend writing real, tangible letters, and I'm a bit old-fashioned in this regard. Letters make people feel as if they have to respond. They give a human-to-human connection. This is something that we forget about with text messages and our modern-day reliance on email. Letters touch people in a way that electronic communications simply never will. Here is a picture of the Avoord airfield itself. You can see Luftwaffe aircraft in the foreground. The hangars in the background are really the main target for the mission on Avoord. Note that they're located right off the runway. And here's an aerial reconnaissance photo taken of those same hangars. Notice the bomb craters pockmarking the ground in front of them. I found this particular picture in a declassified intelligence report on the mission, courtesy of the U.S. Air Force. Then there's this picture. Pretty incredible. This is the actual combat footage of the mission my grandfather took part in on April 28, 1944. Notably, one of these bombers could be my grandfather's actual aircraft. This image captures the formation of B-17s as they approach the Avoord Air Base at 15,000 feet. It's during this approach that one of the lead aircraft is hit by a flak burst, the Georgia Rebel II. As one of the airmen is bailing out of the damaged aircraft, he pulls his parachute too early and it wraps around the tail section of the B-17. As the plane spirals downward, it pulls this poor man down with it to his death. So this is the situation that Clem and my grandfather are flying into that day. This incident also explains some of the burned, misshapen dog tags that I found at the National Archives. This photograph was taken at the moment the bombs were released over the target, at approximately 12 noon. Again, this is actual combat footage of my grandfather's mission. Notably, this is also the exact moment that my grandfather's plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire. Clem is the first to see it from the ball turret below. He observes extensive flak damage to the No. 3 and No. 4 engine. In fact, the gas tank on the No. 3 engine is on fire, and the engine itself is starting to twist free of the wing. Here you can see the moment that those bombs impact. It's significant because it's also the time that the order to bail out goes across the intercom in my grandfather's B-17. My grandfather is the first to bail out. Clem is the last. Clem has to pry his way out of the ball turret and he doesn't have his parachute on, so he has to locate a chest pack in the interior compartment of the damaged plane and strap it on as he jumps out of the escape hatch. Here is a clearer photo of the fire and smoke coming out of those hangars. This is likely the exact scene that Clem and my grandfather saw as they fell towards the earth. Clem describes the experience of bailing out as being similar to sitting in a lazy boy, and I'll tell you what he means by that. He says he felt relief as he leaned back and let the wind fill up his pants. He was relaxed and just watched the ground come up towards him. I asked him how he could have possibly felt relaxed at a time like that. He leaned forward, patted my arm, and said, "I was just so excited to get out of that damn plane." So both my grandfather and Clem execute a delayed parachute release. Essentially, they pull their ripcords at treetop level to avoid German machine gun fire. It's a good thing, too, because Clem could see machine gun fire being directed at him and the other men. At the last moment, however, a P-51 Mustang fighter swooped in and strafed the machine gun positions. Clem said this courageous act likely saved his life. Because of the delayed parachute release, Clem and my grandfather experienced a very rough landing. My grandfather fractured his back on impact and was unconscious. He was dragged into a nearby woodline by local Frenchmen. Clem lands directly on the bombed-out runway, seen here in this image, and he fractured his ankle as a result. So what happens next? My grandfather sets off alone on foot despite his broken back in an effort to get as far away from that airbase as possible. Clem manages to limp to the hedgerows along the runway where he conceals himself for the next 2 days. At one point he can even hear the voices and smell the cigarettes of the German soldiers that are searching for him. Finally he is able to escape. Both men are fortunate to eventually locate sympathetic French civilians. In fact, they both link up with separate French resistance units in the region. You can see a scanned image of Clem's forged French identification in this slide. But here's where Clem's story differs a bit from my grandfather's. There's one key difference. Clem had a companion during his escape. I mentioned him earlier, Herbert Campbell, the waist gunner from the Cutty Sark who just happened to land nearby. And this is where Clem has a great deal of trouble telling the story. Here's a picture of Herb and Clem in wartime France. Herb is the individual on the far right and Clem is second from the right. You can see the cane in Clem's hand which he needed to help him walk. In the initial stages of their escape, Herb steals a bicycle from a nearby home and pushes Clem on it so that he doesn't have to limp along on his wounded leg. Obviously, these men have quite a bond, and they end up fighting together with a French resistance unit in central France. Unfortunately, the German troop presence in this area gets too intense, and the men decide to split up into groups of 2 and to head in different directions to increase their chance of survival. Herb teams up with a Canadian airman that he became friends with in the camp. Clem decides to depart with another man, Regis Carney, the tail gunner from the Cutty Sark who happened to be located at the camp as well. As they head south towards Spain, Clem and Regis come to a deep ravine. Clem begins to climb down when Regis suddenly grabs him and holds a finger to his lips. Down below, Clem can hear the sound of tracked vehicles making their way through the trees. As he looks closer, he can see that the woods are literally crawling with German soldiers. Regis saved Clem's life, but it appears that Herb and the Canadian were not as lucky. They were subsequently captured by the Germans and executed. This is something that has haunted Clem his entire life. He wonders what would have happened if he had been there for Herb to return the favor, to help this man that pushed him through occupied France on a bicycle because his leg was too injured to walk. Here's a monument to Herbert Campbell near the town where he was killed. It's located next to a small village called Le Petit Paris. Unfortunately, Herb suffered a rather violent death. Another escape and evasion report contains a statement that Herb was tortured before he was killed, maybe even beaten to death with a rifle butt. To be honest, this is something I simply don't have the heart to talk to Clem about. Not knowing of their friend's death, Clem and Regis continue on their journey south. Eventually, they run into an American OSS unit. This organization is a predecessor to today's CIA. Clem and Regis fight alongside this unit, conducting hit-and-run ambushes on German troops advancing towards the front. After a few weeks, they decide to travel on by themselves. Eventually, they have the good fortune to run into American lines. Clem told me that rescue missions were conducted by the RAF to fly down American officers out of occupied France. In fact, one of these missions resulted in the rescue of my grandfather in August of '44. Enlisted airmen, on the other hand, were left to walk out of France or to escape on their own. The moral here is, don't ever underestimate Clem's resolve. As a mere 20-year-old, he attempted to walk out of occupied France to Spain with a badly fractured leg, while being hunted by German soldiers the entire way. He's a truly remarkable man. So, despite this amazing story, Clem doesn't have a great deal of information about my grandfather. He never saw him on the ground in France, and he seemed as shocked as I was when I told him about the crime mentioned in my grandfather's report. Clem also tells me that he and the rest of his crew had many reunions in the years after the war. Here's a picture of one of those reunions. Clem is on the right, on the left is his companion, Regis Carney, and in the middle is Jim Cater, the pilot of the Cutty Sark. Clem did have one interesting story about my grandfather, however. I'll spare you all the details, but the long and the short of it is that my grandfather had a bit of a problem with the ladies, which I already knew, of course. Although Clem winked and nudged me at the end, he leaned in and said, "I wouldn't call it a problem, though. To be honest, it was more of a talent." Still brings a smile to my face. So now I'm back to square one. I have no idea how I'm going to learn about my grandfather's experiences, and that's when Clem does something I'll never forget. He looks me right in the eye and asks me if I'd take him back to France, and I look right back at him and say yes, with absolutely no hesitation. And at that moment, I could feel my girlfriend, now wife, literally staring a hole in the side of my head. It could have been the white Zinfandel and bourbon he had fed me all night, but the truth is, I didn't want the adventure to stop. I had to simply continue on this journey. So here we are, fast forward to October 2011. We stopped in London first because I had a bit of a surprise for Clem. I wanted to take him back to where he was stationed in England, Bassingbourn Air Base. By the way, I had a heck of a time driving on the left side of the road. I was terrified that Clem had survived the war only to be injured by my bad driving. Luckily, that didn't happen. And here's the Tower Museum at Bassingbourn Air Base, home to the 91st Bomb Group and the famous Memphis Belle. And this is where I want to stress one thing. The experiences of my grandfather and the crew of his B-17 were in no way unique. During the European campaign, 30,000 U.S. airmen were killed or missing, and another 30,000 were captured as prisoners of war. In all, the 8th Air Force took more casualties during World War II than the Marine Corps and the Navy combined. It's important to remember that there is a great deal of tragedy on both sides of this conflict. What makes this adventure unique, however, is something else entirely. I think you'll see as we progress through the rest of this story. Here we are at the entrance to the Tower Museum. It's run entirely by volunteers, and what a great group of people they are. In this photo, Clem is overlooking the runway at Bassingbourn. This is the same runway from which Clem took off for that last mission 70 years prior. Just think about that. The entire time we were at the museum, something kept happening that was truly heartwarming. People would come up and thank Clem for his service. Not only that, they would want to touch him and hug him. He was a true celebrity. And as evidence of that, I've got this picture. It always makes me smile. I remember showing Clem this photo and asking, "Who's got a problem with the ladies now, Clem?" He pulled me aside and said, "Now listen, I don't want you ever showing that to my wife." He was dead serious too. He and his wife Jo have been married for 67 years, by the way. I love it. These two have an absolutely incredible relationship. Before we left Bassingbourn, I had another surprise for Clem. I had a plaque put up for him in the airbase, and for my grandfather as well. It's an extraordinary thing to think about. In 1944, Clem was a 20-year-old tech sergeant at Bassingbourn. Now he's watching the unveiling of a plaque with his name on it. It was an incredible feeling. And with that, we were on our way to France. I had to include this picture as well. It cracks me up. On our way back from dinner that last night in London, Clem somehow talked a British cabbie into letting him drive the cab. Not only that, but he talked me out of my own hat because it happened to look good in the picture. What a smooth operator. This man truly has a way with words. So here we are in Bourges, France. This is the city closest to the Avoord Air Base. We had another wonderful surprise waiting for Clem upon his arrival. This one was courtesy of my friend Frederick Henoff, the French historian I mentioned earlier. Again, never underestimate what you can achieve with a simple letter, email, etc. But like I said, try to stick with written letters if you have the choice. This is a picture of Clem meeting the mayor of Bourges. It's something he'd always wanted to do when he had the opportunity to return to France. Here's a picture of the entire welcoming committee at the City Hall. They treated us to a variety of local foods and wine. In this picture, Clem is in the center with the mayor. The mayor has the colored sash around his waist. The man in the olive drab jacket, located 2 to your left from Clem, is rather important to this story. He met Clem in the summer of '44. He was only 7 years old at the time. He watched Clem climb into the back of a truck as French resistance fighters transported him south. I say truck, but it wasn't really a truck. Rather, it was something they called a gazogene, a converted vehicle that ran on burning wood rather than gasoline. This man is someone I'll never forget. He came with us everywhere we went in Bourges. It was heartwarming to watch the two of them interact after all these years. The man standing next to me in this picture is Bernard Deville. His father, Joseph Deville, is mentioned in Escape and Evasion Report number 866. In fact, Joseph is the man who originally found my grandfather and saved his life. So how do you thank someone for doing something like that? That is the exact question I'm thinking about here in this picture. To be honest, I don't really know if I ever can. Without this man's family, I simply wouldn't be here, and that's a cold, hard reality, one I now think about every day. I tried to thank him, though, with a $400 dinner and about 5 bottles of wine. We had a great time that night. I figured it was a good sign when I saw his wife pull out a camera and take a picture of her plate. In this picture, there is one other thing I wanted to point out. The billboard in his hand has about 8 pictures of my grandfather taped to it. He brought it with us wherever we went so that he could show other townspeople how much I looked like him. It was a very kind gesture. I'll never forget it. In the next few days, we retraced my grandfather's route south. We visited the cities of Saint-Ouen, Bourges, Pouzy-Maisonget, and Ségan. At all these locations, I was able to kneel down and feel the soil, knowing that my grandfather had walked this same route 70 years prior. Again, it was an extraordinary feeling. I was literally following in my grandfather's footsteps. In the third building in that picture, I was even able to climb the same staircase that my grandfather climbed when he was sleeping or hiding from unknown visitors to the farm. I could literally lay down in the same loft where my grandfather slept. It had been largely untouched since the war and was still in its original condition. In this photo, I'm being introduced to the mayor of Ségan. She met my grandfather as a young girl and shared some wonderful stories about him. She said she first encountered him while he was working the fields for the family he was staying with. She said when he saw her, he took off running in the opposite direction. She ran too, shouting the whole way home, "The Germans are coming! The Germans are coming!" She said that she assumed he must be German because of his unusual size. She also said that he was so tall that he was able to look over the top of that doorway at the barn and peer down from the window above to see who was visiting. In fact, in a historical account that I later read, the townspeople in the region often referred to my grandfather as the Giant American. They complained about how hard it was to find civilian clothes to fit him. And that's when the pictures started coming out. Pictures of my grandfather in hiding when he was just 20 years old. Bernard had some, other local residents had others. People would come up to me and just hold them next to my face and smile. It was so incredibly touching. The picture on the left here shows my grandfather with Bernard's grandfather, Charles Clem. The picture on the right, well, I'd say that might be additional evidence of my grandfather's problem with the ladies. It made me laugh when I first saw it. The picture on the left shows my grandfather with the man who saved him, Bernard's father, Joseph Deville, a man I likely owe my life to as well. In the picture on the right, you can see just how tall my grandfather was. Although he's extremely thin here, probably down 30 pounds or so from the picture I showed you at the beginning of the video. Food was pretty hard to come by, as I'm sure you can imagine. Finally, there is one more picture that was truly amazing. This one was a mystery, a photo of my grandfather taken long after the war. He's probably about my age here, and in the picture with him, a pretty young woman. What's notable about this? The woman is definitely not my grandmother. So did my grandfather have a new family, maybe new children? It certainly gave me something to think about. Now there was one more thing I had been waiting for. I wanted to visit the regional archives and Musée de la Résistance. My hope was that someone there would have more information about the horrible crime my grandfather witnessed. Again, I was hoping to find all the answers from the experts in the region. I was hoping that all my letter writing would finally pay off. We toured the facilities. They had some incredible artifacts. The staff was very knowledgeable and clearly more open to my inquiries than American scholars had been. In fact, we spent hours there. We also had yet another surprise for Clem. We had organized a press conference for him to talk about his experiences. Amazingly, there were French resistance fighters present there as well. And this was big for Clem. He had always wanted to thank the French people for saving his life, and thank them he did. Clem is a gifted orator. He spoke for nearly 2 hours. Afterward, I was finally able to ask some of the questions that I wanted so badly to ask. A big culmination, right? All my research is about to pay off. Not so much. Of particular note, not one of the individuals present, scholar, resistance fighter, or Mr. Dowler himself, could state with certainty where the dreadful event described by my grandfather occurred. But there was one line of questioning that I kept coming back to in all of my conversations. I feel very strongly that my grandfather bore witness to the ruins of the village of Oradour-sur-Glane. Some of the American experts had come to the same conclusion in their correspondence with me. This is a picture of Oradour taken immediately after one of the most infamous mass murders of World War II. On June 10, 1944, a special unit of German soldiers descended on the town and rounded up all of its inhabitants. Civilians were piled into the church and mowed down with machine gun fire. The church was then burned down around their bodies. In all, 642 men, women, and children lost their lives. On June 11th, all that remained of Oradour were the burned-out shells of shops and houses where buildings used to stand. The town was decimated. The thing that is notable about Oradour is that it's within a 4-hour bicycle ride of the Cher département in France. Some of the conduct described by witnesses to the event also seems eerily similar to that described by my grandfather. Moreover, my grandfather and Tech Sergeant Dowler independently participated in resistance activities in this region from the period May through August 1944. Above all, it's important to note that no other massacre of this size or scale took place in occupied France during the war. Here's an image of how Oradour looks today. The ruins of the town, sometimes referred to as Village Martyr, were left as a memorial to those who were murdered. It's essentially a ghost town, left untouched since those sad days in the summer of '44. So is this it? Is this what my grandfather was describing? I think so. Given the scale of what he described, it seems likely. But I recognize that this assertion is hard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. I also understand that others might disagree with me, and I welcome the debate. It's entirely possible that my grandfather was describing events in another town. He could have misjudged the number of casualties and repeated this estimate to a military intelligence officer in charge of his interview. In subsequent correspondence, my friend the French historian summed it up best. He wrote, "Regarding your grandfather's escape and evasion report, I had also read this handwritten note. When he was hidden at Mr. Gerbeau's farm at the time of the Normandy landing, a city not far from there, Saint-Amand-Montrond, was for a short time a place of fights between the French underground and the Germans. But we don't know the whole story, and perhaps your grandfather saw things which were forgotten then in the storm of the following fights at the time of the liberation of the area." Interestingly, the events at Saint-Amand-Montrond do not remotely resemble what my grandfather described, although they are equally horrific in terms of human depravity. To be honest, I'm not sure I will ever definitively know the answer, whether it was Saint-Amand-Montrond, Oradour, or some other location. That's one of the hazards of this type of work. But it doesn't mean I'll ever stop searching. I know that will be an ongoing project for me for the rest of my life. So with that, I had one last surprise for Clem. We were heading back to the Avord Air Base for what was sure to be a great show. This was the same base that Clem and my grandfather bombed on that fateful day in 1944. The base is still operational, in fact, as I'm sure you guessed from the picture here. The base commander showed us unparalleled hospitality. Officers even briefed Clem on the success of his mission. He had always wanted to know just how many of those hangars they were able to hit on their bombing run. I think they understood this old soldier better than he even knew. Clem and his fellow airmen were able to hit 5 hangars. We were both surprised to find out that there are still 2 hangars left standing to this day. After the briefing, they took us up in the tower overlooking the airfield. And as I looked at Clem, gazing out at that runway from so long ago, I realized that everything had come full circle for him. Last time he had been on that runway, he was escaping and evading from German soldiers. Now he was the guest of honor. Previously he had hidden hedgerows. Now he was a VIP. And what a show Clem was in for. The French Air Force had scheduled the takeoff of a Boeing-made AWACS aircraft. They did this to honor Clem. Again, never underestimate the power of a simple letter or email. It's amazing what you can achieve if you just try. Although I have to admit I never saw this one coming. Here is the aircraft taxiing on the runway. And take a look at the foreground of this picture. This is the old runway that Clem and my grandfather bombed in 1944. The new modern runway is actually built right behind it. And as the AWACS aircraft took off in the distance, I wasn't even looking at it anymore. Instead, I was looking right at Clem. I could see something remarkable in his eyes. He was looking back across all those years and thinking of his journey through France, both then and now, and also his journey through life. Right there, at the end of that runway, was where Clem had fractured his ankle 70 years prior. That's when I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. In the rich green grass between the control tower and the two remaining hangars, there were these perfectly symmetrical circles. The grass inside them was lighter in color, and these circles were located in tight groupings throughout the base. These were the bomb craters from that mission in 1944. That's when I realized that the effect of that great conflict was still there, on the runway and surrounding grounds, and on Clem himself, as well as every other soldier and civilian that had experienced that horrible war. So with that last surprise, our long journey had come to an end. Clem and I still speak every week. I drive down to see him regularly. If you told me 5 years ago that I would have a best friend who was 90 years old, I wouldn't have believed you. It's funny how life turns out sometimes. Clem really is the grandfather that I never knew. He ends every conversation with, "Love you guys," and I care for him more than he could even understand. He is truly a kind and generous man, a man who enabled me to discover so much more than I had ever even imagined. Now, if you can just bear with me, there's one last piece of the story that I want to tell you about, the part that makes this story even more unique. You see, I intentionally left out one important detail, one more secret. And now the topic turns back to letters, not letters written by me this time, but letters written by my grandfather. They were shown to me by the families in France. It appears my grandfather went back to school to study French after the war. And here's the thing about these letters. They briefly referenced the pretty young woman in that picture with my grandfather. Not only that, but they mentioned my grandfather's son, and I'm not talking about my father here. So now I had a brand new investigation to take part in. I began to try to track down these people and see if it could possibly be true. It seemed likely I had an uncle I never even knew I had, and I now had the opportunity to give my dad a remarkable gift for his 65th birthday, a new brother. So I set to work having these letters translated, thanks to my friend the French historian. But first I knew there was something else I needed to do. I needed to pay my respects to my grandfather. I had been there to visit him before, but this time was different. I knew so much more about him now because of that declassified report and because of my trip. The Air Force Memorial slopes off into the distance behind his grave at Arlington National Cemetery. It's a very peaceful place. I remember kneeling there and feeling the soil run through my fingertips just like I had done at that farmhouse in France. And that's when I realized something. The journey had come full circle for me as well. It had brought me back to the same place where it had all started just a few months prior, sitting there next to him. And I remember hoping that I had the strength to carry me through this last little bit. In those coming weeks, there was one last big surprise. I discovered that one of those letters actually mentioned my grandfather's new family by name. It mentioned a wife, Mary Lee, and a young son, Michael David. So it was true. My grandfather had another family later in life. Not only that, but I had an uncle, and my father had a brother. I set to work yet again, using much the same processes I had used months earlier to find my grandfather and Clem. And then, almost before I even realized what happened, I found him, my uncle, Michael David Murphy. Not only that, but we were neighbors. He lived in McKay, Virginia, just a stone's throw away from Washington, D.C. So the time had come to sit down and draft one final letter. And this one was much, much harder than any I had written in the past. All of a sudden, it dawned on me that my uncle might not know about us. I had never thought about it before. How do you break that type of news to someone? It took me weeks to write that letter. I drafted and redrafted it dozens of times. And once I finished, I remember being completely filled with apprehension to actually drop the letter in the mail slot. I had reached the point of no return, and I was nervous beyond belief. I knew that once that letter left my fingertips, there was no turning back. Now I had no choice but to wait and see what happened. So how did it all turn out, this wild journey that I was on? It turned out wonderfully. This picture was taken at my wedding. That's my uncle on the left and my father in the middle. Handsome fellows, if I do say so myself. And there is one thing I really want to stress here. None of this, none of it, would have been possible without that one declassified intelligence report from the National Archives. Because of that report, I was able to give my father a new brother. I was able to reunite a family. Although this adventure started off as a search for information about my grandfather, it ended up being ever so much more. So if there's one thing I want to achieve with this video, it's to inspire others to take part in similar research projects. It's true that I may have been uniquely situated because of my background, but here's my point. So are all of you. You are all subject matter experts when it comes to your own individual families and their respective histories. So why not try to learn more about America's veterans, or more importantly, a father, mother, brother, or sister that served? I assure you that if I can do it, you can do it. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. You just need to have the will to see your own individual journey through to its completion. And please do me a favor along the way. Don't listen to the naysayers, these so-called experts that tell you that you're wrong or that your research is not real history. Instead, roll up your sleeves and dig in. Above all else, push on and trust your instincts. You never know, you might find something amazing. I certainly did. And when the going gets tough, I want you to remember one thing, something that a very wise man once told me. It's all about the journey, right? I just love this picture. I had to put it in one more time. Clem is such an incredible man. And like I said, everything in life has a tendency to come full circle. Clem and I shared an experience that I will never forget. It's truly one of the highlights of my life. But I'm delighted that what is sure to be the highlight of my life will be arriving later this summer. My wife and I are expecting a wonderful gift of our own. A baby. And so the journey continues. But you don't have to take my word for it. Here's the man himself, Clem Dowler, providing one final thought. Words to live by, and my inspiration for putting together this entire video.
I think we've covered it pretty well. I would say this, if I had my whole life to live over, I'd go right back and do the same thing.